So, Equestria Girls is a thing. Or, excuse me, My Little Pony Equestria Girls. But that's a bit of a long title, especially when we start to add in the sequels and subtitles. But for those who are unfamiliar, when My Little Pony Friendship is Magic was at its peak, Hasbro decided to try a new tactic to sell more merchandise and ported the cast of its cash cow, or cash pony, to a world where everyone was human. The result was a set of spin-off movies, specials, and shorts with their own canon that ran parallel to the original show, but never really mattered to the plot of that show due to its spin-off status. But aside from Hasbro's blatant commercialism, Equestria Girls was actually kind of amazing. I watched the first movie a few months after it came out on a whim, and the art style was still dynamic, the characters' sense of style was transferred to their human counterparts in a way that was amusing, and the songs were, in classic Friendship is Magic fashion, a bunch of upbeat pop jams, and I was here for it. Especially the remixed opening theme. That shit slaps. Following the first movie, anytime a new Equestria Girls thing came out, I would try to stay in the loop. Not so easy, because by the time it ended there were 4 movies, plus the promotional shorts, 6 specials, along with 2 seasons of a web series, plus a bunch of music videos and other things. And I watched it all, or at least most of it. Over time I found that I had become a bigger fan of Equestria Girls than I was of Friendship is Magic itself. And by the way, none of this is me being ironic, I genuinely love this series. It wasn't because the characters were more balanced, or that the problems felt a bit more realistic, or that the tone was slightly more mature in nature, or that there was a bit more of a continuity than the main series had, or that the humor was slightly more mature and appealed to older audiences. Seriously, this whole segment is one big Saving Private Ryan reference in a snowball fight. It's excellent. Now don't get me wrong, those are all hugely contributing factors, but there was something else going on. I actually have a video on Friendship is Magic, but it's been a hot second since that one came out, so if you haven't seen it, you can go do that, but it was one of my first videos, so it's a bit rough to watch. But in that video, I said, I think there's an element missing, but that's for another rant. Well, this is that rant, 3 years later. Because the thing that was missing was included in Equestria Girls, and it has to do with how the show handles continuity and canon, character growth, and most importantly, how the show handles conflict. Of course, I'm going to sprinkle in some philosophy for good measure, but I think that this show was actually a return to form in regards to the setup of the first season of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. And so today, I want to talk about Equestria Girls. The spin-off came about from the 4th generation of the My Little Pony franchise and toy line, known as Friendship is Magic. This generation had been created by Lauren Faust and exploded in popularity, not just with its primary demographic of young girls, but also older teens and adults. With the approach of the 30th anniversary of My Little Pony, and as a result of this unexpected popularity and interest of older demographics, Hasbro saw an opportunity to expand the My Little Pony brand to an older audience. Because ponies are seen as something for and marketed solely towards young girls in the West, Hasbro wanted to change the look of this new toy line and series. Inspired by the extensive fan art of reimagined versions of the Friendship is Magic characters, it was decided that the new toys would be anthropomorphized. In order to keep the look of the characters and world consistent, the same team that worked on Friendship is Magic was brought on to create the spin-off, including songwriter Daniel Ingram and story editor Megan McCarthy, meaning that not just the look but the sound and themes would be consistent with the original show. McCarthy stated that she wanted the story of this movie to mirror the characters' introductions from the first season, but was inspired by the modern high school setting to try new things with the characters in order to keep things familiar but fresh. The first movie was released in 2013 with a limited theatrical release. It was promoted with online shorts on Hasbro's website and YouTube channel, and was received fairly well by critics and fans. However, there was some controversy over the proportions and clothing choices of the characters. Some people felt that the girls looked a little too idealized and wore outfits that were inappropriate. Despite these criticisms, or perhaps because of them, the characters' clothes were redesigned to fit the occasions or activities they found themselves in for the next 3 years, all of which saw a major release as well as smaller shorts and specials. After the 4th movie in 2016, Equestria Girls switched over to web content with smaller specials continuing the story alongside a dedicated web series. This continued into 2019 with the release of the Holidays Unwrapped special. Around this time, Hasbro announced that Friendship is Magic would be ending. There was hope that Equestria Girls would continue as the creative team still had some stories to tell, and a 3rd season and special or movie were in the works in order to close out that saga, but Hasbro decided to move on to Generation 5, and Equestria Girls was left unfinished. Like seriously, they never even officially canceled it. I'm going to go over all the major plot points from the Equestria Girls movies, as well as some of the specials, and there will be a few details from Friendship is Magic, so if you want to check any of those out on your own, this is your spoiler warning. The story starts out just after Twilight Sparkle was crowned as Princess of Friendship. Twilight is feeling overwhelmed by the change in her life, but her friends Applejack, Fluttershy, Rarity, Pinkie Pie, Rainbow Dash, and Spike are there to support her along the way. When the group travels to the Crystal Kingdom to visit the other princesses, a mysterious figure shows up and steals Twilight's crown before disappearing through a magic mirror. In order to get her crown back, Twilight realizes that she must travel through the mirror to another world. The alternate world turns out to be populated by alternate versions of all the people from Equestria, except everyone is human. Eventually, Twilight finds a student named Sunset Shimmer who is bullying another girl that looks suspiciously like Fluttershy.
What happens when you bring an element of harmony into an alternate world? You don't know? Seriously?
Sunset Shimmer turns out to be the person who stole her crown, but actually lost it. In order to stop Sunset Shimmer from getting the crown, Twilight signs up to compete against her to become Princess of the Fall Formal. To boost her chances, Twilight does what she always does and consults the library. The next morning, Twilight wakes up to find out that Sunset had taken photos of her and is spreading them online to embarrass her. Luckily, Rarity, Fluttershy, Pinkie Pie, and Applejack all come to check up on Twilight, and they discover that they all used to be friends, but Sunset Shimmer messed it up. The group then meets up with Rainbow Dash and they all agree to help Twilight beat Sunset Shimmer because she helped bring them together. They plan a kind of rally in the cafeteria to pump out a jam and try to get people to vote for Twilight. Knowing that she cannot beat Twilight's upbeat attitude, Sunset sabotages the decorations for the Fall Formal and blames it on Twilight. With the Fall Formal cancelled, Twilight apparently has no way of getting the crown and will either have to leave it behind or be stuck in the human world. I mean, she probably just could have asked for it back, but whatever. In a state of despair, Twilight reveals that she is from another world and her friends rally around her and help her redecorate the Fall Formal. They all attend and Twilight wins, but in a fit of jealousy, Sunset snatches the crown and transforms herself, and then tries to turn the crowd into mindless slaves. But Twilight and her friends band together and with the elements of harmony and the magic of friendship, defeat Sunset Shimmer. Twilight then returns home, more confident in her ability to lead. Rainbow Rocks sees Applejack, Rainbow Dash, Pinkie Pie, Fluttershy, and Rarity as they get ready for the school talent show by playing in a band. Whenever they play, some of the magic from Equestria appears and they transform. Sunset Shimmer, having turned over a new leaf, is fascinated by this and wants to know why it happens. Not for malicious reasons, but in order to understand how the magic of friendship works.
Magic came into this world when I stole Twilight's crown. It's taken a lot for me to earn everyone's trust.
Meanwhile, Aria, Adagio, and Sonata, collectively known as the Dazzlings, are tired of feeding off of people's negative emotions since being banished from Equestria to this new world. When they witness the events of the Fall Formal, they realize that there is real Equestria magic in this world and they want it. The Dazzlings transfer to Canterlot High and, using their mesmerizing singing abilities, change the talent show into a battle of the bands and pit the students against each other.
Hey! Anybody here remember fun? I'll give you a hint! It's the exact opposite of being in a rainbow!
Sunset figures out what's going on and enlists the help of Twilight, who travels back through the magic mirror to help her human friends. She deduces that they will need some kind of counterspell in the form of a song that everyone who has been mesmerized needs to hear, but she has no idea how to write one. Trying to help, Sunset accidentally sabotages the Rainbooms and everyone blames her, thinking she's gone back to being mean or selfish or jealous. This causes the Rainbooms to perform horribly, but still get into the final round, which only enrages the other students more. When the Dazzlings perform, they begin feeding off the negative energy of the students, but the Rainbooms come together to perform their counterspell. Unfortunately, the Dazzlings are too strong, and in one last-ditch effort, Twilight calls out to Sunset.
Sunset Shimmer, we need you!
Singing from the heart, Sunset and the Rainbooms defeat the Dazzlings and save the school. The Friendship Games introduces the humans world Twilight, which the fandom refers to as Sci-Twi, who is obsessed with getting into an independent study program where she can focus on figuring out what the strange energy coming from Canterlot High is. This Twilight is a student at Crystal Prep Academy who have a bitter rivalry with Canterlot High, which comes to a head every 4 years at an event called the Friendship Games, where the schools compete in various competitions. Twilight is uninterested in competing as it involves being around other people, but when Principal Cinch tells her that her independent study hinges on a recommendation that won't happen unless she competes, Twilight agrees. At Canterlot High, the girls have been transforming outside of just music now, and Sunset is determined to find out why, both to satisfy her own curiosity and to stop it from ruining the Friendship Games. When the games begin, Twilight uses an energy locating device to find the anomalies around Canterlot High. What she doesn't realize is that she's stealing equestrian magic that occurs when each of the main 7 do an action that relates to their element of harmony. Although they are on opposite teams, the Canterlot girls cannot help but feel friendly towards Twilight, not just because she looks like their friend, but because they genuinely like her. All of this magic cannot be contained and starts wreaking havoc. Upset at Twilight for messing with something she doesn't understand, Sunset lays into her.
But I wanna understand! But you don't!
And worst of all, you put the lives of my friends in danger.
Hurt and upset, Twilight is convinced by Principal Cinch to let the magic go in order to win the games, but is consumed and turns into Midnight Sparkle and sets about attacking those who hurt her. Sunset understands her mistake of lashing out and realizes that Twilight was in the same position she was 2 movies ago, and with the help of her friends, she transforms into Daydream Shimmer and uses her magic to combat Twilight before offering a hand of friendship. The Legend of Everfree opens up with Twilight in a state of anxiety that she will turn back into Midnight Sparkle and the fear that it will always be a part of her. She keeps these feelings from her new friends despite the fact that they are incredibly supportive. But all of this fear is forgotten due to the excitement for the school trip to Camp Everfree. Things start to go awry when the girls discover that they are exhibiting strange abilities while at camp. Applejack becomes super strong, Rarity creates shields, Rainbow Dash is super fast, Pinkie Pie makes things explode, Fluttershy can talk to animals, Sunset Shimmer can hear people's thoughts, and Sci-Twi has telekinesis. But she doesn't want anyone to know about it because she's afraid it will portend the return of Midnight Sparkle. As always, Sunset begins investigating and realizes that these abilities only happen while they are at camp, and that maybe the magic of Everfree is real. As it turns out, there are magic gems in caves nearby that hide equestrian magic, and one of the camp counselors has been exploiting their magic to try and save the camp. But this magic consumes her, and so with their new abilities, the girls join forces and defeat the magic, and then concoct a way to save the camp as well. Following the movies, there were a bunch of short specials and a web series that all depicted the girls in comedic situations, usually revolving around home or school life, with the occasional magical happening, such as getting trapped in a mirror or a magical storm while at sea, and the girls used their new abilities to save the day. While the stakes were usually a little less world-ending than the movies, the focus on character growth and interpersonal interaction offered a lot of excellent storytelling. Okay, so that was a lot of summary, but I promise all of it was important. Firstly, to see how the story relates back to the main series, or perhaps more importantly, why it deviates. When the first movie begins, we are basically watching a longer special episode of the show, both in terms of how the movie opens and the narrative trajectory. The movie starts right after the season 3 finale of Friendship is Magic. Twilight's conflicts are picked up from the show and carried forward through the narrative of the movie. She is struggling with the changes in her life now that she's a princess. She has new wings, there is uncertainty about where she belongs, and about how her relationships will continue with her friends. It is only after all of this thematic conflict is set up that the movie introduces the primary villain and the narrative conflict. And all of this is done in Equestria, not in the human world. Through some plot contrivances, Twilight is forced to go to the human world alone, and while the reasoning bothers me, it serves the thematic storytelling, so I'll let it slide. From this point on, Twilight is now a fish out of water. We see her struggle with her new body.
What does the rest of me look like?
She struggles to fit in socially, and we see her lack confidence generally. But as the story progresses, we see her bring the human counterparts of her friends together and effectively create new friendships with them. We then see her get voted for the Princess of the Fall Formal, which underlines her ability to lead with integrity and care.
A true princess in any world leads not by forcing others to bow before her, but by inspiring others to stand with her.
Throughout the movie, while contending with Sunset Shimmer's mean girl fuckery, Twilight becomes comfortable in her body, comfortable with her friends, both new and old, and she becomes a princess by leading her peers, not by ruling them. By the time she gets back to Equestria, Twilight has overcome all of the thematic and emotional conflict that plagued her, and this is all done effectively without being too heavy-handed, or getting in the way of all the other usual stuff about friendship. The second movie takes place after season 4. In that show, we did see Twilight help complete a spell, but creating one from scratch is new for her. She also feels the weight of everyone's expectations.
Which only makes things harder because the last thing you want to do is let everybody down.
In the end, she realizes she needs to rely on others, and the spell itself is togetherness.
I don't think it matters what song we play, as long as we play it together.
Compared to the first movie, this one doesn't have as much of an impact on Twilight as a character, and from here on out, Equestria Girls basically becomes its own thing running parallel to the original show, especially when Sci-Twi is introduced. Other than a few events, the shows basically take place separately from each other and have very little impact on each other. But instead of being a bad thing, I think this makes Equestria Girls stronger. While the first movie was clearly meant as a companion piece to enhance Friendship is Magic's story, the second movie begins in the human world and does not go back to Princess Twilight until much later, meaning the central conflict and emotional stakes are introduced before Twilight is brought into the story. After that, the show doesn't really feature Princess Twilight at all, beyond a joke or a couple segments. As the separation continued, it gave Equestria Girls the chance to become its own thing, separate from the confines of the storytelling of the original show. While the first movie strengthened Friendship is Magic's narrative, the other three movies' separation allowed for Equestria Girls to tell its own story with familiar faces, but have its own identity and narrative trajectory. It's very similar in premise, but because the setting was more mundane, it allowed more realistic stories to be enhanced by the presence of magic. These stories were also a little bit more mature as the characters were in high school, and for the most part dealt with high school issues. You know, within reason. It's Hasbro, not Degrassi. In the human world, there aren't princesses and fables, but just people interacting. Ironically, this retreat from adventure gave the show the ability to explore the relationships of its characters. The result was a story about characters growing up and dealing with the complexities of relationships, both romantic and platonic, and how these change and grow over time. Something that Friendship is Magic had dabbled in, but hadn't spent a lot of time in terms of how complex relationships work. And nowhere is this split more apparent than with Sunset Shimmer. Okay, full disclosure, Sunset Shimmer is my favorite character in any version or depiction of My Little Pony, so I'm definitely a little biased, but there's a good reason for it. In the first movie, it's pretty clear that Twilight is our main character, as the show acts as an extension of Friendship is Magic. Sunset Shimmer was created as a villain that is everything Twilight is not. From her name being Sunset Shimmer, which is clearly derivative of Twilight Sparkle, to her color palette, which is purposely made of bright warm colors to contrast Twilight's soft cold colors, while still making her distinct. Her hair is curly compared to Twilight's straight, and of course her personality is diametrically opposed, where Twilight is kind, caring, and curious, Sunset is domineering, mean, and manipulative. This is a kind of negative or opposite reflection of Twilight, and keep that in mind because this mirror metaphor is going to be important later on. Because Twilight is the good side of all these traits, she triumphs over Sunset Shimmer, and the day is saved. But it's not quite that simple, because when Rainbow Rocks opens up, we see the Dazzlings. This establishes the narrative conflict, and they're obviously the bad guys. Following this, we get the theme song, and we then immediately cut not to Twilight or any of the other main six, but to Sunset Shimmer. And it immediately becomes apparent that she is genuinely appalled by her own actions from the previous movie.
A demon. I turned into a raging she-demon.
Sunset's immediate introduction includes an emotional arc, and she's on screen before Princess Twilight and is the inciting incident for Twilight's return to the human world. It is from this point on that Sunset Shimmer is ostensibly the main character of the entire spin-off. In the next movie, Friendship Games, she is both the first person on screen and has the first line. She also once again gets her own thematic and emotional conflict, which are set up early on and put her at odds with Sci-Twi. In Everfree, Sunset is still prominently featured. Sci-Twi has her own arc and is introduced earlier, but Sunset has as much, if not more, screen time and still has an emotional and narrative arc. After the first movie, Sunset is the driving force behind the show, and most of the major decisions that occur within the narrative are because of her. Even after the movies ended, she was part of the main cast and gets a magical ability along with her friends. She is the one leading the charge on how to resolve conflicts and solve problems, and that's excellent. The show pivoted from being about Princess Twilight finding her confidence in the first movie to being a redemption arc for Sunset Shimmer. This once again strengthens the show's overall narrative and differentiates it from Friendship is Magic by allowing the characters to deal with the fallout of what happens after a character is forgiven.
And we've forgiven you for your past boo-boos.
Although we do see something similar with Starlight Glimmer in Friendship is Magic, I would argue that Sunset's arc is more impactful because she is brought into the fold of the magic of friendship rather than learning about it from Princess Twilight. We see this in the sort of return of the elements of harmony. In Friendship is Magic, the show moved away from its adventure-based roots when Lauren Faust left, and while Equestria Girls is perhaps less adventure-oriented, it did reintroduce the elements of harmony and often fell back on those ideas. Even in later movies, we can see how the abilities that the girls get reflect their element and personality, with one key difference. So in that first video I did on My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, you may have noticed I said, I think there's an element missing, but that's for another rant. Because Sunset is brought into the fold and is explicitly shown to be part of the magic, I think that she embodies that missing element. And now, it's never explicitly stated that this is what's happening anywhere, so take it with a grain of salt, but I think that the missing element is forgiveness. And you could argue that forgiveness falls under kindness or generosity, but I think the act of forgiving is so hugely important that it deserves its own element, and I think the fact that Equestria Girls turned into a redemption arc for Sunset after she was forgiven only reinforced her place in the group and the importance of forgiveness as a part of friendship and the elements of harmony. Even later on, Sunset's ability matches this element. She can now see others' emotions and thoughts when she touches them, which lets her understand how they feel and leads her to a place of empathy and ultimately, you guessed it, forgiveness. With her inclusion and the inclusion of Sci-Twi, we wind up with 7 characters, each overwhelmingly representing a color of the rainbow. I know it doesn't match up perfectly, but it fits aesthetically and narratively. The first movie starts Princess Twilight's forgiveness of Sunset, who then spends the next movie seeking to do better and in the end finds forgiveness in her friends.
Don't you remember, darling? What we needed to defeat them was you.
All right.
In Friendship Games, we see she makes mistakes and blames Saitwai instead of forgiving her, but does eventually show forgiveness.
Take my hand, Twilight. Let me show you there's another way. Just like someone once did for me.
And then eventually in Everfree, she coaches Saitwai through forgiving herself, having been in the same place.
But I've let magic turn me into a monster too. So if anyone understands what you're going through, it's me.
In the special Forgotten Friendship, Sunset even travels back to Equestria and manages to ask forgiveness from her former teacher, Princess Celestia. Not to mention she spends most of that special showing how much she has changed compared to her former self. So her narratives and stories are almost always centered around understanding and forgiveness, and that is largely why I think the spin-off tended to outshine Friendship is Magic for me. This central theme of Friendship as Magic was renewed with Sunset's inclusion and provided a great anchor for the team. These are great themes for a children's show, but I think we can take this a step further and pull out the philosophical threads of forgiveness. Hang the fuck on. Didn't I make a comment in the episode I did about Hilda about how other shows tend to blow over fight scenes and make sure that there really isn't any conflict, and specifically showed a segment of Friendship is Magic? The difference is that empathy isn't used as a kind of repair all problems, deus ex machina, solve all issues solution that swoops in at the last second to justify the good guys not having to incarcerate or kill their antagonists so everyone can be friends. Yes, I did, and I stand by that video and the sentiment, because in that video I talked about the way that empathy can drive a story and conflict, rather than swoop in and make everything all better. Friendship is Magic and Equestria Girls are definitely guilty of this. But in that Hilda video, I also spoke about how philosopher Jacques Derrida views the other and hegemonic power structures. In this case, the other refers to anything that is somehow different from the self, and that leads Derrida to another concept, something he calls la pire, or the worst.
You're the worst.
For Derrida, the worst is a reference to violence. When the distinction between the self and the other is allowed to exist, it will invariably lead to the worst. It's important to note that the violence described doesn't necessarily have to be physical. Therefore, conflict in any form can be viewed as the worst. In the case of Equestria Girls, all of their conflicts are resolved through acts of kindness or friendship.
We are a really forgiving group.
So while this does come across as an easy fix where everyone gets an easy ending without any actual fighting beyond the Sailor Moon-esque transformations, this does support Derrida's idea that we should avoid the worst, i.e. violence, at all costs. And yeah, it does feel a bit too easy and saccharine, but once again, Equestria Girls differs from Friendship is Magic with the inclusion and focus on Sunset Shimmer. In the first movie, Sunset as a character makes the mistake of causing conflict. She sets herself apart from others through means of control or power, and this leads to violence. She is the worst.
You were pretty bad at the fall formal.
But she learns forgiveness, and we see her change over the next few movies, episodes, and specials. We see her make mistakes, but she's always trying to make amends and avoid the worst. As a result, Sunset becomes an exemplary person. Similarly, Derrida gives an answer for how to stop the worst from happening. He calls on people to enact what he calls unconditional hospitality, and Sunset becomes the embodiment of this idea, both in her narrative, thematic, and emotional arcs, as well as in her superpower. She is constantly trying to learn to open up to others and get them to open up to her. Of course, she makes mistakes, but she's only human. Or pony. But she tries, and this is exactly what Derrida refers to by unconditional hospitality. When walls are put in place, it creates a division between people, and he thinks this is what leads to the worst. By reducing the differences between the self and the other, the likelihood of conflict happening becomes smaller and smaller. Sunset's acts of forgiveness are exactly this, an attempt at reducing the difference between people, regardless of what they've done in the past. She allows herself to be open to the idea of unconditional hospitality. Derrida mostly applies these ideas to nations or groups of people, but he does note that these ideas are still applicable between individuals, and they might be even more poignant when applied to a single individual. And here we come back to that mirror metaphor from before. In the first movie, Sunset is a reflection and representation of everything that Princess Twilight is not. But by the time the fourth movie rolls around, she's learned to be at peace with the mistakes of her past. When Saitwai is dealing with the internal conflict and fear of becoming Midnight Sparkle, Sunset tells her that the internal conflict is hurtful. It's a kind of inward violence.
You are not Midnight Sparkle!
But it's not that Midnight Sparkle is the worst, but the fear and anxiety. The conflict itself that exists within Saitwai is the worst, where she is the self and Midnight Sparkle is the other, which is reflected by Sunset's arc. Sunset was the negative person of Princess Twilight, or the other, and created conflict which led to the worst. She then helps heal another version of Twilight in Sci-Twi by embodying and teaching unconditional hospitality.
That is awesome!
Yeah, it kind of super is. It is all representational, but it's kind of different versions of the other all coming around over and over again in order to teach and show forgiveness and basically get rid of the idea of the other. Now, Derrida does critique his own ideas. While unconditional hospitality is better in that it's not the worst, it's still subject to problems and criticism. It must be monitored and continually reevaluated because it's easy for people to fall back into conflict. Humans are really good at that. But it can also leave individuals or groups open to being used by others. So while it is better to be forgiving than to be violent, it must still be scrutinized. I do think that Equestria Girls does have an answer to this, and while it's not the only answer, it is a decent one. And that is through the support of friendship and community, which provide a safety net for people to rely on.
I can help you, Twilight, and the rest of our friends can be there for you too, but not if you run away.
Friendship also provides alternate points of view on how to maintain unconditional hospitality while still being critical of its downfalls. Think about it. The show constantly berates us with the fact that the girls are so different but can still be friends and how this is a strength. And I think that's true. Not just because it's a nice sentiment, but because it actively promotes the acceptance of alternate points of view, which reduce the differences between people, effectively eliminating the idea that someone can be an other. It's not the best answer because it's vague at best, but it's a good basis for coming up with a better solution. So while the show does gloss over conflict by allowing empathy to be a catch-all solution, which is unrealistic, it does differentiate itself by sticking with a character who embodies the idea of forgiveness and unconditional hospitality, which makes the solution feel a little less simplistic because it bolsters the show's central themes, which leads to the idea that anything is better than violence. Throughout the history of Friendship is Magic, there was always an overwhelming push towards overcoming conflicts through friendship, but it wasn't until Equestria Girls, and specifically the inclusion of Sunset Shimmer and her character arc, that the avoidance of conflict felt justified, at least for me. Once the theme of forgiveness was explored through the change in main character and the freedom to explore Sunset's narrative away from the main show, it became obvious that the show was about forgiving others and yourself, and avoiding the violence that is derived from creating divisions between people. It is a shame that the spin-off was unceremoniously halted, because while I loved the shorts, I do think Sunset deserved a finale. The rumors that I hear swirling around the internet say that the planned finale did focus on Sunset coming to terms with the fact that she displaced her alternate world self when she came to the human world, and has to ask for forgiveness for taking her human counterpart's place, and in turn show forgiveness to her counterpart for all the conflict that the alternate Sunset had been causing. Sunset would then return to Equestria with all the knowledge and memories of friendship that she gained during her stay. And while all of this is just speculation, I do think it would have been a great way to wrap up the redemption of a character that brought something more to the story of friendship, who was the embodiment of forgiveness, and made it so that not having any kind of climactic fight scene in any of the show was actually okay because it meant avoiding violence for the sake of her character arc rather than just because. Though they still got to shoot rainbows at people, I guess.
You have magic you do not understand, but it is nothing compared to the magic of— Yeah, we get it! Light her up, lady!
So yeah, maybe avoiding conflict through the power of friendship is a bit dumb and unrealistic, and doesn't reflect how society or individuals actually function, but unconditional hospitality is unrealistic too. It needs retooling and constant vigilance in order to function. It's not the best, but it's far better than the worst. And that is why Equestria Girls is more than just a spin-off, and why it definitely deserved a proper finale. Here are my stray thoughts. Despite the show focusing on Sunset Shimmer, the shorts and web series did a great job of giving all of the characters a chance to shine in their own narratives. I love the colors and visual direction of the show as an extension of Friendship is Magic. I also genuinely love the music, but I'm a sucker for a good musical. My favorite piece of the show was The Legend of Everfree, followed by Sunset's backstage pass. While I do like this show and I stand by everything I said, I do think that Hilda's exploration of empathy is more realistic and makes a more compelling narrative. But this show will always have a special place in my heart. Hey! Thanks so much for watching that episode. Don't forget to hit that like button with your rainbow magic powers. I think the reason that I had so much to say on this one is because I don't really get a chance to talk about it in person with other people, because there's still a lot of stigma around an older dude talking about something that is meant for girls, so it felt good to talk about this on the internet. You can see the video that I did on My Little Pony before, where I talk about a lot of social stigma around that. Don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss anything else that's coming up right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.